If you're into videos about supernatural phenomena, unsolved mysteries, and true crime, you've come to the right channel. We upload new videos 2 to 3 times a week, so if this sounds like the content you enjoy, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of our weekly uploads. Now, let's dive into the video. Sheryl Powell had always loved the outdoors. Even as she grew older, the mountains, the trees, and the open sky were where she felt most at peace. That's why a camping trip to the Inyo National Forest in California didn't seem like a big deal for her, despite the remote and rugged terrain. She and her husband had done trips like this for years, and this one wasn't supposed to be any different. But what happened to Sheryl Powell in July 2019 would end up being one of the most terrifying experiences of her life. It was a warm summer day when Sheryl and her husband Joe drove out to their planned campsite. The Sierra Nevada mountains loomed large and majestic in the distance, a sharp contrast to the harsh desert landscape they had just left behind. They had chosen a secluded spot, perfect for a quiet weekend away from the world. As they arrived, Sheryl decided to take their small dog, Miley, for a quick bathroom break while Joe stayed behind to park the car and unload their gear. Sheryl wandered just a little way from the campsite, into a thicket of trees and brush. The sun was high, casting soft golden light through the branches, and the sound of the wind rustling the leaves created a peaceful backdrop. It was the kind of quiet she cherished in the wilderness. After walking for a few minutes, she stopped to let Miley sniff around when something shifted in the air. Sheryl noticed a figure moving in the corner of her eye. Her pulse quickened, but she calmed herself. It was probably another camper or a hiker, she thought. This was a national forest, after all. But when she turned her head fully to get a better look, a chill crept down her spine. A man stood just behind a cluster of trees, not far from where she was. He was tall, with a rough, unkempt look, and he was staring directly at her. His eyes were cold, unreadable, and something about the way he stood there watching her set off alarm bells in her mind. Sheryl froze, her body instinctively tensing. She glanced back in the direction of the campsite, but it was out of sight now. She had only walked a few minutes, but in the wilderness, a few minutes could feel like miles. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his gaze never leaving her. Fear crept into her chest. Without thinking, Sheryl slowly started backing away, keeping her eyes on the man. Miley seemed to sense her fear and pressed against her leg. The man still didn't move, but something in his posture made her certain that he was not there by accident. He was waiting for something. Sheryl's heart pounded in her chest as she turned and began walking quickly back toward the campsite. Her breath was shallow, and the panic was rising faster than she could control it. Every few steps she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the man following her. But each time she looked, there was no one there. He had vanished as quickly as he had appeared. But the sense of being watched didn't leave her. When she reached the spot where she thought the campsite should be, she realized with a jolt that she had somehow lost her way. The landscape around her had changed, or maybe it was her mind playing tricks on her. The once familiar trees and rocks now seemed unfamiliar, twisted. She spun in a slow circle, trying to orient herself, but there was no sign of Joe, no sign of the campsite, no sign of anyone. Sheryl's breathing became ragged as the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was lost, and somewhere out there in the forest, that man was still lurking. She tried to calm herself, thinking back to her years of hiking experience. She knew the basics of survival, knew how to stay calm, how to retrace her steps. But none of that seemed to matter now. The fear was like a fog, clouding her mind, making it impossible to think clearly. For hours, Sheryl wandered the forest, trying to find her way back. Her legs ached, and her throat was dry from the heat and the dust. She had no water with her, no supplies, Everything had been left behind at the car. And all the while, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man was out there, somewhere, watching her. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of the leaves felt like an impending threat. As dusk began to settle over the mountains, Sheryl knew she couldn't keep going like this. She needed to find a place to hunker down for the night, a place where she could stay hidden. She found a small alcove between two large rocks, just big enough for her and Miley to squeeze into. She sat with her back against the cold stone, her knees pulled to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. Darkness enveloped the forest, and with it came the true terror of the wilderness. Every sound seemed amplified in the night air. She held Miley close, her only comfort in the terrifying vastness around her. She had no idea if Joe was looking for her, if search parties had been called, or if anyone even knew she was missing yet. All she knew was that she had to survive. The night passed in agonizing silence. Sheryl dozed in and out of a fitful sleep, her dreams filled with the image of the man standing in the shadows of the trees, always watching. When dawn finally broke, she wasted no time. She had to keep moving. Staying in one place felt like a death sentence. She hoped that if she could just keep walking, she'd eventually find the campsite, or at least stumble upon someone else. But as the hours stretched on, her hope began to wane. The forest seemed endless, and the longer she was out there, the more it felt like it was swallowing her whole. Her legs were weak, and her body ached from dehydration. Every step was a struggle, and still that feeling lingered, the feeling of being hunted. On the third day, Sheryl was running on pure adrenaline. She had barely slept or eaten, and her body was starting to fail her. She stumbled through the forest in a daze, her mind clouded with exhaustion. It was in one of these moments, when she had almost resigned herself to her fate, that she saw movement again in the distance. This time, it wasn't the man. It was a dog. At first, Sheryl thought she was hallucinating. She blinked, trying to focus her vision, and then she heard voices. Actual voices. She forced her legs to move faster, her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the source of the sound. It wasn't a hallucination. A group of searchers, accompanied by a search dog, was combing the area. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stumbled toward them, weak and barely able to speak. They found her, sunburnt, dehydrated, and shaken to her core, but alive. Miley, who had stayed by her side the entire time, wagged her tail as Sheryl was led to safety. When they brought her back to civilization, Sheryl recounted her story. The man she had seen, the way he had stared at her, how he seemed to disappear when she looked away. The authorities searched the area where she had gotten lost, but found no trace of him. No footprints, no signs that anyone else had been there. It was as if the man had never existed at all. But Sheryl knew what she had seen. She could still feel the intensity of his gaze, still remember the way he stood so unnervingly still. The official explanation was that Sheryl had become disoriented and wandered off course, a common occurrence in such vast and rugged terrain. But there were parts of her story that couldn't be explained. How she had lost the campsite so quickly, how the forest had seemed to shift around her, and most of all, the man. Who was he? And where had he gone? Sheryl never went back to the Inyo National Forest after that. Even the thought of returning to those woods filled her with a deep sense of dread. She had survived, but something about the experience had changed her. It wasn't just the physical toll of being lost for days. It was the unsettling mystery of it all. The man, the sense of being watched, the way the wilderness seemed to conspire against her. Though she had been found, there were still questions that haunted her. Who was the man in the forest? And had he really disappeared, or was he still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness, waiting for his next victim? And more disturbingly, had he been watching her the entire time she was lost, just beyond the edges of her sight, following her every move? Sheryl had survived those 4 days in the wilderness, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker had been at play. Something beyond what could be explained by the isolation of the forest or the tricks of a tired mind. Whatever had happened to her out there, it was something she would never fully understand. In the months that followed, Sheryl kept mostly to herself, avoiding the media attention that had surrounded her rescue. But the story of her disappearance spread, and people began to speculate. Some believed that she had imagined the man, that her mind had played tricks on her in her dehydrated state. Others weren't so sure. They knew that the wilderness had a way of revealing strange, unexplainable things, and Sheryl's story was just one of many.